want to say docu-val to all of you for coming. We have much work to do, all of us, and I'm really thank you for being here. Let me just say the slides that I'm using, which are pretty much the same slides I used yesterday, are much shorter than some of the slides I've used elsewhere. And because basically what I'm going to do is to present what the main mechanism is for the EMFs producing effects, but I'm going to do that much more briefly, and I will be providing written materials that will be downloaded here in the break, and so that you'll have access to a lot of the references that demonstrate what I'm going to talk about. This is a figure that kind of summarizes the way in which EMFs work in the cells of our bodies. So as I think everybody here knows, every cell in the body has a plasma membrane around it, and in the plasma membrane are certain channels that allow things to move back and forth. And I'm going to be talking about what are called voltage-gated calcium channels, which are the main targets of the electromagnetic fields. And what the electromagnetic fields do is they activate these voltage-gated calcium channels. And as I think probably all of you know, calcium levels in the cell normally are kept about 1/10,000th of the concentration outside the cell. So when you open up these channels, you get huge amounts of calcium flowing into the cell, and you get very large increases then in intracellular calcium. That's what this is. Ca2 plus I is the calcium in the cell. And that acts to produce pathophysiological, that is, damaging effects, via two different pathways. One is that calcium signaling is extremely important in the cells of our bodies, and so when you have excessive calcium signaling, that can cause pathophysiological effects. There's a second pathway by which intracellular calcium acts. It produces increases in both nitric oxide, NO, and superoxide, and these two react with each other extremely rapidly to form peroxynitrite. Peroxynitrite is a potent oxidant. It's not a free radical, but it breaks down to form highly reactive free radicals. And these then go and attack essentially all the components of the cell. It attacks the DNA, attacks proteins, attacks lipids, and other things. And so that can cause all kinds of havoc. And you produce, of course, oxidative stress. And all of these things act then to stimulate NF-kappa B and produce inflammation. So all these things can then contribute to the pathophysiological effects. There are also impacts of these peroxynitrite free radicals, oxidative stress, on the mitochondria. And so the mitochondria, of course, are where you get your ATP energy, and so they become dysfunctional. And that also contributes to the pathophysiological effects. Now, I want to say one other thing about this, and that is there is a pathway here which is activated when you have relatively modest increases in intracellular calcium, and that's the nitric oxide signaling pathway, and it leads through cyclic GMP signaling and protein kinase G to stimulate the activity of NRF2, which is a very important regulatory system that helps protect us from many different effects on our cells. And this it produces therapeutic effects. So you can get genuine therapeutic effects from the EMFs, and as well as these pathophysiological effects. They occur under different circumstances. So generally, when you have modest increases, you get a lot of that. When you get much higher increases, you get a lot of that. One thing that's important here is the following. This peroxynitrite pathway and the nitric oxide signaling pathway essentially produce opposite effects. And in fact, each of these pathways, and that's not shown here, inhibits the other. So you can have situations where one of them is predominant and other situations where the other one is predominant. You get essentially opposite effects. For instance, you can get both hypertension and hypotension following EMF exposures. So it's not at all unusual to get very different effects under different circumstances, and that's something that you need to know about. What's tragic about this is that when the industry people look at this, they say, oh, it's inconsistent, so we don't pay any attention to that. You have to pay attention. These are not inconsistent because they occur under different circumstances. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is talk about 9 different non-thermal effects. These are effects that occur at levels far, far below our safety guidelines, at where there's little or no heating, and they are, each of these are extensively documented by published review articles on the occurrence of these following EMF exposures. Some of these are studied in humans, some in animals, some in cell culture. We have all kinds of studies that are done here, but these are all things that are produced. So there are many effects that produce lowered fertility, and as I'll talk about later, the most important of these actually involves lowered male fertility, and those are already very, very far advanced in our societies. But you have a whole bunch of other things that go on. You get almost everything. You get impacts on the testis and the ovaries, the structure of them. You get lower numbers of follicles. You get increased spontaneous abortion. You get lowered levels of each of the 3 sex hormones. You get lowered libido. Anything you can think of that impacts reproduction is negatively impacted by EMF exposures. And there are widespread neurological and neuropsychiatric effects. These are also very, very far along in our societies. And you can see a lot of the things that are going on here. You get, in addition to these effects that we notice in terms of our symptoms, you get changes in the EEGs, in the electrical activity of the brain, and in the release of neurotransmitters. Every single neurotransmitter in the nervous system is controlled by VGCC activation and intracellular calcium. So the EMFs acting via VGCC activation have absolutely powerful effects on the nervous system. And not surprisingly, you get cellular DNA damage of 3 different types, 24 reviews on that. These include both single and double-strand DNA breaks and oxidized bases. And all of these cause important kinds of mutations in human genetics. And all of these also produce important mutations at the cellular level that are important for cancer causation. So, so we have, these are important. And let me just say, it's known in human sperm that we get these DNA effects with exposures we have every day. So things like Wi-Fi and cell phone radiation impacts the DNA in human sperm. And you can, so these are of great concern with regard to mutational effects. We have apoptosis, programmed cell death. That's important both for the reproductive effects and the neurodegenerative effects. I haven't said anything about the neurodegenerative effects yet. And let me say, most of the citations in my entire document can be found in this document, or sorry, in my slides. And I will provide, that's one of the copies that I'm going to provide here. So anyway, you can access it either off the internet or you can access it from this, or from the copy here. So you get oxidative stress, free radical damage, which you've already seen how that occurs, and that, oxidative stress and free radical damage have roles in essentially all chronic disease in humans. You get hormonal effects, endocrine effects. As far as I can tell, every single hormone system in the body is impacted by EMFs. Not always the same way. In some cases, in fact, in some cases, what you see are increases in hormone release in short term, and you may get decreases long term from long-term exposure. So sometimes these things are complex. You get excessive intracellular calcium, as I've already said, is the probable underlying cause of almost everything else. You get cancer. There are 38 reviews on cancer. And actually there are more than that. This was the number I came up with when I wrote that document. And since then I found still more. As far as I can tell, the only reason why we're still discussing cancer is because the industry is so powerful that it can basically shed discredit on things even when the science is absolutely clear. That's my opinion. They're cardiac effects on the electrical control of the heart. And they can cause both tachycardia, rapid heartbeat, bradycardia, slow heartbeat. These involve long-term exposures. These are produced instantaneously. You get arrhythmias in both cases. Arrhythmias are often associated with sudden cardiac death. We have, as you probably know, a huge epidemic of sudden cardiac death occurring in athletes dying in the middle, apparently healthy athletes dying in the middle of an athletic competition. And the approach to that has been, well, we put defibrillators around, try to bring these people back to life. That's all fine and good, but why aren't we worrying about the actual cause? So there are a lot of very, very strange things that are going on here. Some of these I'm going to talk about in more detail later on, and so don't forget about them. Pulsed EMFs in most cases are much more biologically active than non-pulsed EMFs. And the pulses I'm talking about here, I'm actually going to talk about two kinds of pulsed EMFs. These are modulating pulses. So we have an underlying frequency in these wireless communication devices, and these are modulated by pulses, so they vary in their intensity from one nanosecond to another. And and the pulses, and these, there are 13 reviews that have shown that these pulsed EMFs are in most cases much more biologically active than our non-pulsed or continuous wave EMFs of the same average intensity. What I'm going to show you is that the safety guidelines are entirely based on average intensities, and therefore they don't work for a number of reasons, and we'll talk about those very briefly. There are also nanosecond pulses that occur. Okay, there are also nanosecond pulses that are defined as pulses between 1 nanosecond and 1 microsecond. Now these are pure pulses; they just go up and they come down, and they also produce effects. And let me just say, these pulsed effects and these pulsed effects, they all go through VGCC activation, voltage-gated calcium channel activation. So what they produce in the cells of our bodies is very similar, but they are somewhat different. Now, one of the things about, okay, so the safety guidelines, and these include the ICNIRP safety guidelines and all of the others, which are basically copies of them, which includes the EU, the UK, the Australian ones are identical to the ICNIRP safety guidelines. The US FCC and Canadian ones are very, very similar, so they differ very modestly from the ICNIRP ones. They're all based on average. The ICNIRP, they're all based on average intensities, usually averaged over 6 minutes. And what I said here before, these don't, the pulsed EMFs clearly, the pulsations influence things, so you can't just use average intensities. The allowable intensities are based on thermal effects, heating effects, but we're getting all kinds of effects that occur at the levels of many orders of magnitude lower, as you've seen. And as you've also seen, the VGCC activation is involved in producing many of these things. So when we have nanosecond pulses here, what do the safety guidelines do? They say, okay, you should average them over 6 minutes. So let's say you take a typical 40 nanosecond pulse and you average it over 6 minutes. You're averaging it over approximately 10 billion times longer. So what does that do? It drops the average intensity by a factor 10 billion. So instead of being way up there in the stratosphere, it's down sitting right on the floor. And of course, what the safety guidelines then predict is you can't possibly get an effect, but you do over and over and over again. So, so we have this absolutely bizarre situation where every time we have repeated studies that test predictions of the safety guidelines as to whether they predict biological effects, what you find is the safety guidelines fail, and they fail massively. I mean, these are not small effects, these are absolutely gigantic effects. The safety guidelines have no science behind them whatsoever, and therefore, you know right at the core of the scientific method is the following. You have a theory, it makes predictions, you test the predictions. If the predictions fail, what do? You throw the theory out. Here we have, I've only given you 4 different types of evidence. There are actually 8 total. I think I may talk about another one in a bit. And every single time, the predictions fail and fail absolutely massively. And so the requirement under this of ICNIRP, of the regulatory authorities, of the European Commission is obvious. You need to throw out these safety guidelines. And yet, all of these organizations are embracing the safety guidelines, and it's complete and utter scientific nonsense. So I want to get to 5G. Now 5G, as you all know, this is the latest generation of wireless communication. 5G is designed to be extraordinarily highly pulsed in order to carry extraordinarily high amounts of information per second. That is the way it is designed. That is its total reason for being. And 5G is estimated to produce from 20 to 100 times as much communication as 4G, which itself is extraordinarily highly pulsed. And as you'll see later in one of the presentations, you see huge increases with each of these steps. You go 2G to 3G, 3G to 4G, 4G to 5G. You see gigantic increases in pulsations. And yet, all of that is totally ignored by the regulatory agencies, by ICNIRP, by the industry, etc. And yet, it is truly extraordinary. So, and the way 5G is designed, and this is actually a 4G, 5G system together, and I want to emphasize that because the 4G part of it is important as well, is we're talking about extraordinary numbers of antennae in close proximity to basically every building on Earth, which makes these, and these are strong effects. It's been estimated in a paper that was published, 3 years ago, I guess, that the 5G will entail something like 30 times more higher intensities. Now, I have to say the industry denies this, but what's also been going on is that a number of these regulatory agencies are in the process of greatly increasing their allowable exposures. Like, for instance, the Finnish one proposed they're going to put it up 20-fold. And when, as you say, the ones that they had before don't work at all, and you get huge effects. In some cases, at levels 100,000 times below the safety guidelines. I want to say something about that, which I don't have in my slides here, but I think it's important. One of the things that's been found is that there are what are known as intensity windows. So if you study the effects, the biological effects of a particular kind of EMF, and you can vary the intensity just by varying the distance from the target, right? Easily study various intensity differences. And when you do that, you find there are certain regions of intensity where you get maximum effects. But when you go lower or higher, they drop way down. So you can have in fact, there was one study that was done where you had a nice window effect, and they went higher to up to, in little steps, up to 150 times higher. And it was still much lower effects than they had at the window. And some of these windows, are at levels about 100,000 times below the safety guidelines. And and it could well be, if you increase the exposure up to the safety guidelines, that the effects might be lower than they were way down at the low levels. So these things are essentially completely unpredictable. And so it really means not only that the safety guidelines we have don't work, but it's very difficult to figure out which ones would work. And so this is a nightmare of absolutely incredible proportions, because we've got this multi-trillion euro set of companies, the telecommunications industries, put out all these things based on these safety guidelines, and we are being heavily impacted by these already. And the new 5G, I think, is predicted to be much, much worse. And I think that's in fact what we're seeing now, where it's been rolled out or tested. So, I predicted, and other people have predicted, that 5G, because of the extraordinary pulsations, the extraordinary numbers of these, in close proximity and the high levels of the intensities, would produce massive biological effects. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing so far from what data we have. Now, I want to make one thing here. One thing here. One of the things the industry has predicted is that because we're using millimeter waves here, and millimeter waves have much higher frequency, and the electrical parts tend to be absorbed quite efficiently by building materials and by body materials, that they predicted that the 5G can only produce effects in the outer 1 millimeter or so of the body. They predict that the only effects will be limited to 1 millimeter in the body. We know, in fact, that's not true. And the way we know this is there have been published millimeter wave studies. Some of these are 30 years old or more. These are not highly pulsed millimeter waves. These are just continuous wave millimeter waves. So we have every expectation that that 5G, as I say, will be vastly more dangerous. But what's been shown is that those millimeter waves produce effects on the human brain. You get changes in the EEG and also in behavior. And we're seeing now 5G producing neuropsychiatric effects in people. So I think that so clearly, in order to impact the human brain, it has to go through the hair, the skin, the skull, and the meninges that cover the brain. So they're clearly working much, much more deeply than the industry claims is possible. So, okay, I'm going to go back. How can this happen? Okay, and so I've written about this. I think the way it can happen is actually quite simple, and that is that the electrical parts of the EMFs are absorbed relatively easily. The magnetic parts are very highly penetrating. When they penetrate into the aqueous parts of our bodies, what do? They put forces on dissolved ions. And when they do that, they move them. And when they do that, they regenerate the electrical parts. Same frequencies, same pulsations, just much lower intensities. As I've said before, you can get very high effects at very low intensities. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing with these. And there's similar observations, by the way, that have been made with microwaves, where it's been estimated they only go in a couple of centimeters, but in fact we know they go in vastly more deeply than that in terms of producing effects. Okay, so so now what I'm going to do is talk about my 6 worst scientific nightmares regarding 5G. And each of those, we have reason to think they're already very far along from the exposures we already have, completely apart from 5G, but and that those exposures will make things vastly worse. So the first one I want to talk about is fertility, particularly lowered male fertility. There was a meta-analysis published by Lezing et al. In 2017, I've got the title of it here, that showed that sperm counts in every single technologically advanced country on Earth had dropped to below 50% of normal. Now, I can't tell you for certain that this is caused by EMFs, but what I can tell you is we simply don't have any other hypothesis that explains them. And given the fact that we know that not only sperm counts, but other things I'm going to mention that are relating to male fertility are caused by EMFs, and given the fact that we know the safety guidelines, which were the whole basis for claiming these things were, wouldn't produce health effects, we know they're completely bogus. That's the obvious explanation. And that's the obvious explanation for other things. Now, there was a study that was published by Magros and Xenos, a couple of Greek researchers. It was published over 20 years ago on what happens in mice to reproduction. And what they did was they took young pairs of mice and they put them on the ground in little cages in an antenna park. So there were a whole bunch of broadcasting antennas that were there. The levels at the intensity levels at ground level where these things were 10,000, less than 1/10,000th of the allowable levels according to our current safety guidelines. So they were very, very low. And they actually studied this at 2 locations. So there shouldn't be anything happening if the safety guidelines work. Now what they found was, and let me just say, a gestation period in mice is about 30 days. So you can get 1 litter in 30 days, and a little over another 30 days later you can get another one, and so forth. So you can study these very quickly. What they found was, at the higher level exposure, again, it was extremely low level, they found, okay, we got 1 litter, but the numbers were down. We got a 2nd litter, but the numbers were down. No 3rd litter. Reproduction crashed, fell off a cliff, and crashed to 0, essentially to 0. If you take these out of the field, you see almost no recovery. So most of the effects are apparently irreversible, and the effects are obviously cumulative because you don't see all the effects right away, but over a relatively short time period you accumulate enough damage that you can get massive effects. Let me just say there are a number of these areas where we see cumulative effects. I think these are due basically to the impacts on the structure of the tissues where they become aberrant. And I won't spend any time to try to rationalize that, but I think we're seeing tissue impacts in these studies. And let me just say, at the lower level exposure, Magros and Zeno showed the same pattern, except it was the 5th litter that crashed to 0. So the question is, are we seeing any evidence for these kinds of things in human populations? And I think we are. There are big effects that we're seeing now in 3 densely populated, high technology East Asian countries. These are effects on reproduction. These are not measured on the sperm, but there are also more recent studies in Switzerland and Finland and Denmark, so here in Europe, where there are massive effects on male fertility. I think the most interesting of these is this very recent one that was published about 5 months ago. I've got the citation here. And what they found was that there were strong, they concluded 62% of young males were infertile. These were based on measuring sperm count, sperm motility, and other measures of sperm quality. So these are conventional measures that are used, clinically to look at, what males appear to be infertile. And so they had major impacts with lowered sperm count, lowered motility, and especially lowered levels of sperm, other measures of sperm quality. They said there were only 4% of the sperm that were normal. Yeah.
Irreversible, those counts?
That we don't know. I mean, obviously, we know what the situation was in mice, but here we don't know what the situation is. Yeah, it's whether you can reverse it or not by taking them out. As I say, I think that the irreversible parts are due to changes in testis structure. And that's been studied in animals. It hasn't been studied in humans. But when you get, drops, these kind of drops in sperm count, that in animals, that's what it's caused by mainly. It's caused by the impact on the testis. You can get direct effects on motility just by irradiating sperm with these radiations, and you see effects, for instance, in human sperm from Wi-Fi and from cell phone radiation exposures that that we have all the time, and we do know that there's data in humans for impacts on these things. Men who carry their cell phones right here, and or even in their front pockets and those kinds of things. You know, they're people who use their laptops with the Wi-Fi sitting on their lap. You know, so there were a couple of studies in Finland and Denmark that were published a little bit earlier, in which things were better than, I think, the Swiss situation, but still quite bad. 78 or 79% of the males were either in the low fertility or infertile range. Now, most of those were in the low fertility range. So they are, you know, they are better than the Swiss ones that came about a year later, but not good. So it really looks like we are seeing rapid crashes in reproduction in human fertility, which I would predict are going to drop within 2 years to well below 10% of replacement levels. Now, we'll be essentially extinct within 2 years if that happens. And these are rough estimates, I want to say that. But you can see these are going very, very rapidly. And, you know, and as I say, we know that all three of these things that were studied by in Switzerland, we know those are impacted by EMF exposure. So, you know, it's not a big jump. And so I think what you can say, you can say, well, it's conceivable something else is causing this. But we're taking risks of the sort that no rational society on earth can possibly take. These are simply totally unacceptable risks. And when you have all of this evidence and when you know that all these exposures are based on safety guidelines that are bogus, you have to stop it. It's simple. Now, these are things we already have. These are based on the exposure we already have. These are completely apart from 5G, completely apart from further expansion of 4G, completely apart from putting radar units in cars so they can drive themselves, completely apart from all of the other exposures that are planned for us, whether we want them or not. This gives you some idea of where we are. Okay, let's go on. So I think it's highly probable that 5G radiation could easily push things over 10 times faster. From the extraordinary, the high intensities, the extraordinary level of pulsation. This is a guess, okay? I'm not saying this is a hard estimate, it's not. But we have every reason to think that 5G is much more dangerous, and I'll tell you, we already have some empirical evidence on that. Neurological, neuropsychiatric effects. What happens? I can't sleep, I'm tired all the time, I'm depressed. I've got headaches. I can't concentrate. Got cognitive dysfunction, what people call brain fog, is all over the place. Anxiety, stress, agitation, memory dysfunction, sensory dysfunction. You have sensory problems in the eyes, in the ears, and the other sensory organs. Which one of the effects is tinnitus. So you have all these things going on, and you know, so they're going on. You also get changes in the EEGs and other, you know, and when you study these in animals, you find there are changes in the neurotransmitter activities and so forth. So almost everything that impacts the nervous system is being impacted. In the animal studies that were published back in the 1950s and 1960s, they concluded that the nervous system was the most sensitive organ in the body. The second most sensitive organ was the heart, and the third most sensitive was the testis. These were in terms of changes in the structure of the tissues following exposures. So histological studies. Now, so there have been occupational exposure studies that were done back in the 1970s and 1980s when we had almost no other exposure. So you could actually study, okay, in this occupation you got these kinds of exposures, and these are the ways in which people who are exposed respond over time. And there were quite a number of studies of that sort that were done. So we have some ideas how fast these things progress, get more severe over time from those studies. We also have some idea from studies of the brains in animals. I mean, the obvious thing is, you know, 5G is going to make this vastly worse. We're already seeing that. We're seeing major neurological, neuropsychiatric effects in Switzerland, in Stuttgart, and those have been, you know, those have been written about. There's also large effects that are occurring in Los Angeles. Those, to my knowledge, nobody's written about, but the really horrendous ones in Los Angeles is what I've been informed from people there. So we are, and let me just say, when you turn on 5G, you're only going to see a tiny, tiny fraction of what any mature 5G system will produce. Why? Because 5G is supposed to communicate with the Internet of Things, communicate with billions and billions of devices. When you first turn it on, there's almost nothing to communicate with. So the number of pulsations you're going to have initially is going to be a tiny, tiny fraction of everything. We're already seeing severe effects. Okay, I'm going to do this very quickly. There are reasons to think that very early onset Alzheimer's and dementias can be caused by EMFs. So what are they? First of all, we know that calcium, intracellular calcium, has a very important role in causing Alzheimer's disease. We know that we have people suffering from what they call digital dementias, where they're exposed to EMFs. And young kids develop dementias from this sort of thing, and which is, now we don't know how similar or different those are from Alzheimer's. We do have epidemiological studies that show that EMFs cause Alzheimer's, and what I'm going to focus on are these two studies in rats. What do we have? Those studies in rats show that the only thing you need to do to convert a perfectly normal rat into a very early onset Alzheimer's rat, and I'll tell you what I mean by very early in a minute, is to give them a series of EMF pulses. You can get essentially 100% conversion to very early onset Alzheimer's rat. Just give them a series of EMF pulses. That's all you need to do. And if you just give them once, one day, in fact in 1 second, you can give a bunch of pulses. You can get, you can do this in 2-month-old rats, and by 18 months you see all this very early onset Alzheimer's. Now rats live to be about 36 months, about 3 years. So those are still, those are relatively young rats. If instead of doing it once, you do it once a day, then you start seeing Alzheimer's type things in about 4 months later. So these 6-month-old rats, this would be the equivalent of very early on, very, very, very early onset Alzheimer's in humans, let's say 12 or 13 years old, just from a series of EMF pulses. I mean, there is reason to think that that autism can be caused by this, and I don't have time to talk about it, but we may well see essentially universal autism from 5G. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I think it is very reasonable that it could happen. DNA damage is a big problem in terms of our gene pool being contaminated by very large amounts of mutation. That's a big concern. Cardiac effects, which I don't think I don't have time to talk about, but they are, we know that that EMFs can cause these, including sudden cardiac death, and there is reason for high-level concern where we have lots of antennae, and the 4G, 5G system inevitably involves very high antenna densification. Let me just say a few things about what we're actually seeing now. We're seeing unusual limb defects in humans in areas where we've had 4G or 5G or high density 4G exposures. Why do I think this has to do with EMFs? It's simply because the ion channels have been shown to develop those kinds of limb defects, both in animals and in humans. And so these include both the voltage-gated calcium channels and also voltage-gated sodium channels, which are also activated by the EMFs. I haven't mentioned that. So there are these effects from Switzerland and Stuttgart, Germany, where we're seeing widespread neurological, neuropsychiatric, and cardiac effects. As I say, these are quite serious effects But as I said, whatever you get when you first turn on 5G is going to be a tiny, tiny fraction of what you're going to see. In Stuttgart, you're also seeing very high increases in electromagnetic hypersensitivity. The physicians have been very important in Stuttgart in terms of protesting this, and I think that's very, very important. I'm going to skip through that. There have been issues about panic attacks in cattle in the Netherlands and more recently in France as well. Let me just say that we know that VGCC activation can cause fear responses in animals and in humans, and we also know that the EMFs and VGCC activation can produce very large increases in norepinephrine, which is the fight or flight hormone. So it seems to me, as probably a non-professional in this area, combination of fear responses with fight or flight hormone sounds very similar to me to what the cattle seem to be doing. Okay, so I just want to say we have much safer alternatives with wired systems. They are much faster, more reliable, more secure. We should be going in that direction, not this. And I just simply add, okay, let me go down to the next. Okay, there's been a lot of industry propaganda coming out as what are supposed to be news articles. And I want to say with regard to physicians, this is my last slide. We should have extensive biological safety testing before any 5G is put out. And this is what I've been calling for and what other people have been calling for and what the industry refuses to do and the regulatory agencies refuse to insist upon. And I think this should be particularly obvious to physicians who know that all drugs must be extensively tested before they are put out. And drugs, at least we have some protection in the sense that, the physician is deciding whether to prescribe them. And the patient even has the ability to say, hey, I don't want that drug. But the problem with these is we have no choice in the matter at all. So the emphasis should be, if anything, we should have much more testing of these than of any drug, period. I think the other thing is that we need our rights under the Nuremberg Code, which basically says all of this shouldn't be criminal. Okay, thank you.
What are you going to do when 5G is launched?
Well, I don't know. I live in Portland, Oregon. The city council has caved on 5G, despite all the information that I gave them and other people gave them. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I may be involved in some lawsuits on this, but that's not adequate. I don't know. I will probably go find some rural hiding hole and spend my time there. And when I come into the city, I'll probably put one of these things on to protect my head, and I will probably wear, which I'm actually wearing right now, one of these shielded T-shirts. You can see through these things. You can read through them. They make you look pretty weird, but they do work well. And I have to say, I use these when I travel because often the Wi-Fi in hotels is sufficiently high that it's hard to sleep, and I find it helps a lot. So anyway,
I've read that insurance companies are trying to exclude this problem in insurance rules. Can you confirm that?
Yeah, in fact, it's gone on since 1997. That insurance companies either won't insure this at all, won't insure for liability for health impacts, or if they do, they will only insure it at very high cost with with policies that can be canceled the next year if there's some unfavorable court decisions. So basically, in theory, you can get insurance, but in practice, it's useless. And so, you know, there have been a number of reports that are put out by Swiss Re, which is the second largest reinsurer in the world, about this issue. And in fact, they put out a recent one on 5G specifically. So yeah, they're really big issues. And the insurance companies, of course, they make their money by assessing, you know, possible, possible liability losses, you know. And so they're very careful about assessing these things. Yeah.
Can 5G penetrate a wall of 74 millivolt per millimeter? Or can it only penetrate a wall of 20 millivolt per micrometer?
Well, I think you can get penetrating effects from the, I mean, you know, what was shown in the studies, you know, and I'd have to go look up exactly what levels they were looking at, but they were seeing penetrating effects. These are not, again, not the highly pulsed EMFs of 5G. These were non-pulsed millimeter waves, and they were getting very deep penetration. So I think any of them can penetrate, really. And let me just say one other thing about this. You know, the fact that the electrical parts of the EMFs get absorbed relatively easily probably means that they are particularly active in interacting with the charges in the voltage sensor, which controls the VGCC activation. So you know, there's a double effect there that I think is important. And let me just say one other thing about this. When I think you're gonna, I think what you get is a lot of effects in particular areas of the body where there's a lot of extracellular water. You know, so we're talking about things like obviously the amniotic fluid in terms of effects on the fetus, things like the aqueous and vitreous humors in terms of the eyes, and I just found out that blindness is a problem not just from cataracts, but also from other things. I think that you get, anytime you have a lot of water, what do you have? You have in the blood, the heart and stuff, and the whole cardiovascular system, in the kidneys, in the gut, and so forth. And we are seeing a lot of effects that seem to be associated with those that we don't have time to talk about.
Do you have any notion about that some microbes, viruses, are becoming more virulent? Some biological life might be harmed, but some biological life might be potented, have more potency?
Yeah, I mean, you see, you know, essentially every organism that's ever been tested is actually fairly sensitive to this. But there are obviously variations from one species to another. There has been some suggestion that you know, in terms of the GI tract flora, that in fact there might be negative impacts with regard to human health because of a shift in GI tract flora. I don't really know that literature, so I can't really comment on it. The only other thing I'd say is there is some evidence that you get increases in the production of mycotoxins from fungi from EMF exposure, and so that would make them more dangerous. Yeah. So, but you know, a lot of these things we just don't know that much, and so I'm sure there are thousands of things that we're going to learn over time if we survive very long, which is questionable. But anyway, yeah.
I have in fact 3 questions. What do you think that is the most important mechanism for EHS patients? For further of that, what do we have to ask to our doctor for investigation to see if we are EHS or not? Are there some signs in the blood they can find?
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me just say, Dr. Waldmann Celsam in Germany has some very strong evidence that she's published on, which strongly suggests that the VGCCs themselves become hypersensitive to stimulation in the EHS people. So in other words, they have much higher effects on their bodies because the regulation of the VGCCs has changed so that they're hypersensitive to the EMFs. I have some ideas about how that probably happens, but I'm not sure I want to try to comment on them here. Because it's complex and I'm probably going to get bogged down. I do think there are, in terms of testing, you know, the obvious things is that you can test almost anything that the VGCCs produce. So you can test things like oxidative stress, for instance. In fact, there's some data on that in literature. And there are lots of other things. You know, you can test inflammatory responses. There are a number of other things that can be tested. Let me just say one other thing about that. You know, there have been claims, oh, this is all a nocebo effect, and it really doesn't exist. But there are clear studies which show that at least a fraction of the EHS people are genuinely hypersensitive, and that can be demonstrated in blinded studies. So, you know, and has been. So I have no doubts that this is a real phenomenon. That doesn't mean that everybody who reports being EHS is really EHS. That we don't know yet. Okay.
As far as I understand, there is at this moment no real research done on the 5G they want to introduce. So you talked about
So what we have are the reports since they've been either testing it, and I haven't talked about all of those because of limited time. All we have are the reports, you know, either on human impacts or animal or plant impacts. Let me just say one thing about this that I didn't say. I believe that, I published on how EMFs work in plants. EMFs work in plants very much the same way they work in our bodies. It's just that there are other channels that are involved. And they also allow calcium to flow in. And so it's a calcium effect in plants as it is in animals. And the channels that are involved have the same kind of control as the animal channels do, the same structure that's controlling it. So we know a lot about calcium signaling in plants. And one of the things that EMFs do via calcium signaling is they can produce very large increases in highly volatile and highly flammable terpenes. And so it's my opinion that a lot of the fire problems that we've been seeing in different parts of the world are caused by EMF exposures, not by, at least not solely by climate change. And we've seen a number of fires that have occurred in areas where 5G was turned on. The most dramatic of them was that a day and a half after they turned 5G on in South Korea had the most horrendous fires in the history of the country. And these were in 5 of the smaller cities along the east coast of South Korea, where the fires spread with stunning speed from one city to an adjacent city and so forth to cover 5 cities. They had tens of thousands of people fighting those fires because they were so horrendous. But nobody's talking about the possibility that 5G caused them, as far as I can tell, other than me. And let me say, in Southern California, there have also been fires in areas where 5G was turned on, including along the I-405 corridor, where we had really horrendous fires just recently. So anyway, that doesn't prove that those things are caused by 5G, but it certainly raises a red flag.
What kind of effect does 5G has on the bees?
On bees?
Yeah, but because the bees are so low at the moment.
Yeah. Good question.
And when I remember,
Yeah.
Einstein said, when there are no bees, we will be dead in 3 years.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite that bad, but it's bad. Okay, so let me just, okay. There were 2 patents that were issued in the US, one in the year 2000 and one in the year 2001, to use millimeter waves as insecticides. Millimeter waves are stunningly active in killing insects. That's not surprising really because of these very, very high level surface effects. There are, and there have been lots of studies done on bees and EMFs, not, of other sorts, where there are also large effects on the behavior of the bees, including the kind of communication system that bees use to communicate where the other bees should go to collect, collect nectar and spread pollen around. So, so we are in very deep trouble, I think, for those reasons. And what's strange about the whole bee problem is that there is a large literature on EMFs impacting bees, and everybody's worrying about the neonicotinoids, and I have no problem with that, but nobody's worrying about the EMF effects. So that gives you some idea where we are. So I've heard that there are massive effects of not only 5G, but also these high-density 4G systems on insects. I haven't seen any publications yet, and I don't know what's out there. I haven't really had the time to research that.
Over bijen. In Nederland zijn meer dan 200 verschillende bijensoorten, maar 2 bijensoorten zoals wij die kennen voor bestuiving en de andere zijn wilde bijen. Onder de wilde bijen constateren diverse boswachters aanzienlijke teruggang de afgelopen jaren.
Wonder what I can do to protect myself and my garden from this thing, if it's coming, or even me and my neighbors.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, the way they're trying to do this is it makes it as hard as possible to avoid these things, and obviously avoidance is the best way. And there is shielding you can use to help protect yourself. You can use things like graphite paint, which is quite an effective shielding, that you can paint your walls. It's a black paint, but you can cover it with some other color paint. And it works quite well, and it's relatively inexpensive, although all these shielding things cost real money. I mean, they're not real cheap. You can put things over windows, including plastic shielding and curtain materials that are open but have metal fibers in them, and they work as fairly good shields as well. So you can. I showed you what some of the kind of clothes you get. You can people often are most concerned about exposures at night, mostly because of the sleep, the impact on sleep, so you can sleep under a canopy that's basically a Faraday cage that can protect you from these things. So that can be helpful. So there are a lot of things you can do, but everything takes a lot of work. And then of course, you can put plastic shielding on your car windows when you're driving around. That should help a lot in terms of lowering your exposures driving around. Plants are impacted by these, and I believe that 5G will have especially heavy impacts. But we were seeing large impacts, say, from 3G antennae, and that's been published, and on trees and other kinds of plants. So there are all kinds of things going on here, and it is a real challenge protecting yourself. And I think my opinion is we have to stop this, or we're going to be gone. Some of us may survive a lot longer than others, but that's my opinion, is that we have to stop this. And there are plenty of ways in which we should be able to stop it, but that doesn't mean we will.
Someone already asked you, in a lot of slides you presented 5G results, study results, but
yeah, those are really not studies, those are observations.
Observations.
That's what they are, yeah.
But most of your concerns on
on 5G are almost the same concerns on 4G, 3G, I guess. So we are already in a very bad situation in the last 20 years, to your opinion, okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think 5G will be vastly worse than the others for the reasons I stated. And that's what we're seeing so far from these exposures, both human exposures and animal exposures and probably plants as well. But, we have limited data, but what data we have doesn't look good. It looks quite bad, actually. So, but yeah, I mean, my position is that we not only have to stop 5G, but we have to start rapidly reversing a lot of the exposures we already have in order to survive. And I think that many of the exposures can be easily reversed. For example, we don't need Wi-Fi for anything. You can do everything wired. And, I think it is, stunningly, and I won't go on. Okay.
En met betrekking tot de vraag van zo even, wat kan je doen aan onderzoek? Welke parameters kun je in bloed terugvinden? Dat is een hele mooie guideline van of de Austrian Medical Association, the Diagnosis and Treatment of EMF-related health problems and illnesses. En de EMF syndrome. Het is een bundeltje van 17 pagina's, denk ik, waar het volledig staat uitgelegd en wat zeker een aanrader is voor alle mensen die in de medische sector werken of te werk staat zijn.
Ik zal nog even het Nederlands doen. Als huisarts zie ik heel vaak uitslagen van sperma-analyses en bijna altijd is 98% has a form which is different, a bad form. 2% is a normal form. But that's enough to get pregnant, if it is moving good.
But they do impact motility as well.
Yeah.
And sperm count. So all three of those are impacted. Yeah.
But we see now
Yeah.
about the form, about 98% has
Is
this
that
form.
abnormal?
Yeah,
And how does that
yes.
compare with what we saw 20 or 30 years ago?
Okay.
How does that compare with what we saw 20 or 30 years ago before we had all these new exposures?
It's more. I'm working 30 years.
You said it is very difficult to get good limits to know would it be 100,000 lower than the public limit, or maybe 1 million lower. So, but you have some guess, but maybe 100,000 times lower.
Well, I actually proposed as that it should be 7.2 million times lower, but the problem is, we even have, let me just say, there are some frequencies, specific frequencies that have been identified, which produce biological effects at many orders of magnitude lower than nearby frequencies. Very specific frequencies that produce massive effects at extraordinary low. So, the more you learn about this, the more difficult it is to propose any kind of a safety guidelines that you can have any confidence in. And I don't, it's, I guess my opinion is that what we need to do, first of all, is to get rid of all the exposures that are unnecessary, and we need to start decreasing as rapidly as possible the other exposures. There are many ways to do that, and still be able to use, be able to have the benefits of these technologies. There are ways to, cell phones are obviously the most difficult parts of these things, but even cell phones, there are ways that we could drastically decrease our exposures. They might be somewhat less convenient, but there are ways to do that. And so we don't need to give up the benefits to protect our health. That's, yeah.
If we would abandon all wireless use in our Western society, it would be impossible. So,
well, the only thing that requires some kind of wireless is cell phones. None of the other things do. You don't need you don't need wireless communication for anything else. And you can use things like infrared, transmission and things of that sort. You need line of sight to do it. But there are many ways that we can drastically lower our exposures. And in fact, the cell phone companies have taken out patents for cell phones, and then they never use them for anything. We just are simply not trying to do what can be done. What we are doing right now is running as fast as we can in exactly the wrong direction.
Yeah, I had another question. It's possible now to use the LED light to transfer data, and that has no radiation, and we can use that in our houses if we want no Wi-Fi. We can use that, and we also have the glasvezel cable, which is very fast, which is also possible.
Yeah, I guess my opinion is better to use infrared than to use visible light, because you do get responses to visible light. But other than that, yeah, I agree with you. There are ways to do these things. Yeah, that's right.
It's about willingness, I think.
Well, I think people need to know what's happening to them. And I think when people know what's happening to them, I strongly suspect that people will say, well, okay, we've got to make some changes. And but we are rapidly approaching the crash of our societies, and if we just let things go, we will go into utter chaos, and it's as simple as that, and that will happen within a few years. And we're talking about the end of civilization, and European civilization as well as all the others. So, and I don't think that's an overstatement.
We komen aan het eind zo'n beetje van het vragenrondje richting professor Pall. Maar misschien een deel van de vragen had betrekking op bescherming en wat kunnen we doen. En misschien heeft de bouwbioloog daar nog een nadere aanvulling op.
Aanvullingen zijn er eigenlijk niet gek veel, want de meeste dingen zijn al genoemd. Wat heel belangrijk is, dat je bewust met deze materie omgaat. Dat werd net al even aan de andere kant gezegd. We hebben niet alles nodig, we hoeven niet allemaal draadloze verbindingen te hebben, maar neem ook wat afstand. Probeer te vermijden dat je in direct contact komt of dat je in de nabijheid zit van een zender bijvoorbeeld. Wifi hoeft niet altijd zo te blijven, dat kan je namelijk ook vast verbinden met een kabel. Je kan zorgen dat je wifi alleen gebruikt op het moment dat je het nodig hebt. Dus zet de vliegtuigstand aan op je mobiel of wat dan ook. Maar als je s'avonds naar bed gaat, zet niet alleen de wifi modem uit, maar zet ook alle wifi zenders op de laptop, de iPhone, de iPad en dat soort dingen allemaal uit. Dat is veel belangrijker als allemaal gaan afschermen. Want die dingen, die zenders, die wifi zenders, die staan in jouw hele directe nabijheid. Dus daar moet je voor zorgen dat je daar van weg blijft. Ik heb zelf ook een mobieltje, maar die staat eigenlijk bijna altijd op vliegtuigstand. En ik heb dan daar geen problemen mee. Alleen op het moment dat ik nodig heb dat ik een draadloze verbinding moet opzetten, maak ik daar gebruik van. En dan gaat die weer uit. Waarom hebben we nou de hele dag, 24 uur per dag, een draadloze verbinding nodig? Nergens van. Nou had ik nog even een andere antwoord op de vraag van die meneer daar zo. Over die veldsterkte die voor 5G geldt, of wat die gemeten is. Het antennebureau, het overkoepelende orgaan van de gesponsorde overheid, die heeft metingen gedaan, veldmetingen op minimaal 150 meter afstand van een testlocatie van een 5G-antenne. En daarbij hebben ze gekeken naar 2 soorten verbindingen, draadloze verbindingen, 5G-verbindingen van antenne naar antenne en gerichte zending. Dus dat gaat naar kleine eenheden zoals bijvoorbeeld een telefoon. Dat is heel gericht, dat is persoonsgericht, apparaatgericht. Die zijn heel sterk gebundeld. Op 150 meter afstand was de gemeten gemiddelde veldsterkte ongeveer 2 volt per meter. Nou, Volgens de ICNIRP is dat ruim onder de 61 volt per meter. Maar de bouwbiologische gezondheidsnorm, en dan praten we dus niet over de stralingsnorm zoals de ICNIRP aanhoudt, maar de gezondheidsnorm, die ligt op 0,006 volt per meter. Nou, dat is het verschil met zoals we eigenlijk zouden moeten kijken naar de biologische effecten waar dokter Pall het allemaal over gehad heeft, waarop dat al begint op te treden. Overigens werken we internationaal op een andere waarde, namelijk de veldsterktewaarde van de microwatt per vierkante meter. En dan wordt het verschil nog veel groter, want de overheid die houdt aan 10 miljoen microwatt per vierkante meter en de bouwbiologische norm volgens de SBM is 0,1 microwatt per vierkante meter.
We gaan over naar de laatste vraag.
Dank u wel. I got a little translation. Dank u wel. And I just add, you know, yeah, the safety guidelines. Anything that's based on safety guidelines are, you know, ridiculous. We know they don't work, and so any claim on that basis, whatever, is bogus.
Last question.
Well, I still have a scientific question. You told about changes in water by EMF. Is there some scientific knowledge about changes in air? Because I have the feeling that in an area where there is a lot of Wi-Fi or EMF, other EMF, that I get irritation of my lungs. And is it my body that is reacting, or is it something in the air that is changing?
It could well be your body, and it could involve the fluid in the lungs. And I talked about the importance of the fluid in these situations, where you have penetration. So it could well be the fluid. I mean, your lung always has fluid in it, so it could be that's what that'd be my guess of what's happening. Yeah, thank you.